I hope you are all well. I'm very happy to report that I am once again on my 4th day of having this blue band on my left wrist. This means for 4 days, I have not actually criticized someone out loud in some gratuitous way. I'm giving myself a little bit of slack. It has to be a gratuitous way, as opposed to just a perfectly legitimate critique, because there's a difference between criticism and critique. Of course, I haven't gotten out much for the last few days, and that I found really, really helps a lot. I suppose when I go out over the weekend, I'll be high. At greater risk. Anyway, we'll see how I do. I hope you're all doing very well. And I have a lot to speak with you with you this evening. Last week, we covered the sequence of illusion, how it is that we fall under the influence of the qualities of material nature that make us appear to be who we are. The idea of meditation in material consciousness. We usually think of meditation as being a spiritual practice, but last week we covered how meditation works in such a way as to bring us into a state of material consciousness, or what is meditation in material consciousness, and how we put that sequence in reverse. How we take the sequence of events that bring us under illusion and roll that sequence back in such a way as to extricate ourselves from illusion. We're going to revisit that reverse engineered sequence a little bit later. We covered verses 62 through 68. This evening, what we're going to do is come to the conclusion of the Yoga of Analysis, the end of chapter 2 of the Bhagavad-gita. We will talk about the difference between night and day and night, and night and day and night. We'll speak a little bit about the practice of contentment, and then we're going to do a review of the entire chapter. So we'll just take in broad strokes, a trip down memory lane, and we'll see what all of us remember. We will cover specifically Gita verses 69 through 72. So here we go, tonight's verses. I am going to read all of the translations. It's just a short set of verses. And then we will go back and look at these verses one at a time. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 2, verse 69. That which is night for all beings is the time of awakening for those who are self-controlled. The time of awakening for all beings is night for the introspective sage. Text 70, just as the ocean remains just as the ocean remains unmoved by the incessant flow of rivers that continually fill it, one who remains unmoved by the incessant flow of desires attains peace. One who pursues such desires does not. One who relinquishes, 71, one who relinquishes all selfish desires moves through life in a state of freedom from worldly aspirations, renouncing all sense of proprietorship and discarding all sense of egotism. One attains peace. O Partha, Arjuna, text 72. Upon attaining this state of spiritual consciousness, one remains free from bewilderment, being firmly established in such consciousness, even if only at the moment of death. One extinguishes the forest fire of material existence and attains the spiritual realm. So those are our verses for this evening. And now let's go through them one at a time. Okay. The first one is the one that we're going to chant this evening. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time or close to it, or are not all that familiar with the diacritical marks that give us pronunciation cues in transliterated Sanskrit that is written out in the Roman alphabet, the bars over the vowels indicate a long or very open sounding vowel. An accent mark or an apostrophe over the S is an SH sound. The dot under the H at the end of a line indicates you echo the vowel that preceded it back. So here we go. I chant, you chant back. Yanisha sarva bhutanam tasyam jagarti samyami yasyam jagrati bhutani sa nisha pashyato munehe. So again, the translation. That which is night for all beings is the time of awakening for those who are self-controlled. The time of awakening for all beings is night for the introspective sage. So let's take a closer look at the Sanskrit before we proceed. Samyami is a key word in this verse. Samyami indicates a person who is samyama, one who is self-controlled. So we find this term, samyama, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali as well. Samyama, meaning complete restraint or complete control, is a phrase used to describe the combination of the last three of the 8 limbs of yoga, namely dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, or concentration, meditation, and spontaneous absorption in the object of meditation. So another way to think about this is that one who is absorbed in complete concentration, meditation, and spontaneously absorbed in the object of meditation has kind of lost interest in other pursuits. In other words, think of it like this. That which is night for all beings is the time of awakening for those who are self-controlled. So those who are self-controlled is the key phrase. You can take this verse both literally and figuratively, because someone who is interested in cultivating their inner spiritual life is likely to be awake early in the morning when things are really quiet, before the sun comes up, when those who are not so interested in pursuing this kind of inner life, this inner spiritual awakening, they're probably still going to be asleep. And because someone who is interested in spiritual life is likely to get up before the sun rises, they're likely to go to sleep when the sun goes down, which is just about the time when everybody else decides it's time to party. In addition to the literal meaning, there is also the figurative understanding that the difference between material life and spiritual life is like the difference between night and day. A person who is absorbed 100% in their spiritual life will simply not be all that attracted to worldly affairs. They won't be glued to the 15-minute news cycle, constantly wondering or worrying about what's going on out there. They won't get all that excited about the fact that the Washington Capitals are in the Stanley Cup finals. It's just not that big a deal. Whereas someone who is absorbed in material life rather than spiritual life, well, you know, that's going to be their concern. And that's where their attention will be directed. So the difference between night and day. What the introspective sage finds completely fascinating, the inner journey of spiritual life. Someone absorbed in material life will think, boring. And for the introspective sage, all of those material pursuits, the material world and all of its goings on, it just doesn't hold the same attraction as it may have in the past. This can be a problem, because someone may come to a point in their life when they feel their spiritual life is really the thing that matters. And friends and family may not share the same enthusiasm for that inner journey. And now, the problem is that the introspective person on that inner journey runs the risk of invalidating the experience and values of friends and family who are still really interested in the material world and don't really have much of an interest in the spiritual. How do you navigate that? Well, that can be a real challenge. And for the introspective sage who is still engaged with the world, which is the kind of introspective sage that the Bhagavad-gita is speaking about here in this section of the Bhagavad-gita, where we're talking about karma yoga, the yoga of action, the yoga of engagement with the world. This requires a delicate balance. It requires that one find the time, make the time, prioritize one's life in such a way that one can engage wholeheartedly in that spiritual pursuit according to one's level of inspiration, while at the same time, to the extent that it is practical, necessary, or desirable, remain engaged with people who are important to us in our lives. Without making it seem like you are no longer interested in what they are interested in. Some of that may be unavoidable. And of course, some of that, your own inner journey requires that understanding from people close to you. I'm just pointing this out because it can be a challenge. And we all have to figure out how we're going to navigate this particular challenge. Okay. All right, so our next verse. Just as the ocean remains unmoved by the incessant flow of rivers that continually fill it, one who remains unmoved by the incessant flow of desires attains peace, and one who pursues such desires does not. So this is a nice analogy. And one of the reasons I like this analogy is because in one sense, the ocean is unmoved. In another sense, the ocean is dynamic. It has extraordinary energy. It has extraordinary and practically limitless diversity. It's never the same shape twice. It's always moving. It's filled with innumerable life forms. The ocean provides us with a very nice analogy for something we discussed earlier on, which is the three aspects of the absolute truth that are not different from one another, non-dual, even though there are distinctions. If you look at the ocean from high above, like satellite level, beyond the Earth's atmosphere. It looks pretty still and pretty blue and pretty uniform. And you can know something about the ocean by looking at the big picture from that distance. When you move closer to the surface of the ocean, then you can see so many variations of color, so much movement, so much variation in its shape and its currents and such like that. And then, you know the ocean on another level by being close to the surface. And then when you dive beneath the surface, then you see that it's populated with so many varieties of marine life. Similarly, Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, the three aspects of the absolute truth, the impersonal aspect, or the spiritual energy of which everything is ultimately made, is Brahman. And that is analogous to the big picture of the ocean. Paramatma, the supreme self within the heart of all selves, is analogous to approaching the surface and seeing the dynamic energy on the surface of the ocean. And then Bhagavan, the supreme personality. You see the personalities within the ocean when you actually enter into the ocean. And we spoke earlier about the idea that to be a person means to be in relationship with other persons. So the personal form of the supreme being also has a relationship with other beings. And therefore the analogy holds that so many beings live inside the ocean in the oceanic environment in relationship to one another. So that's another way to think about this. The other thing, of course, is that this is a very practical suggestion. When we gain a little bit of distance from our desires, only then can we truly appreciate how many we really have and how they actually enter into our minds just like rivers, nonstop. As soon as you let go of one, there's another one right behind it in the parade waiting to take its place. And sometimes it feels like they come from different directions, depending on the nature of the desire. So if you think of your mind like a giant reservoir, and your senses as rivers that transmit desires associated with those senses, constantly sending desires to that reservoir of the mind, then it's really like multiple rivers entering into that ocean of the mind. And learning how to let those desires come without responding to them, not saying how high when your desires say jump, is the intermediate step towards stilling the mind. Verse 71, one who relinquishes all selfish desires moves through life in a state of freedom from worldly aspirations. So, the person who is constantly pursuing worldly aspirations, very difficult to have a peaceful life. These verses act as a summary of what Krishna has told Arjuna up to this point, which is that by remaining equipoised, not thrown off by the pursuit of happiness, per se, not being compelled by desires is actually a state of freedom. If you think about it, more often than not, we are ruled by our desires. We are compelled by our desires to pursue the fulfillment of those desires. And that is a problem, or at least it starts a whole chain reaction of obligations to fill in order to pursue the fulfillment of that desire. We become entangled in the fulfillment, in the pursuit of that fulfillment, and our lives are not peaceful, nor are we free. So renouncing all sense of proprietorship, this is mine, and discarding all sense of egotism, it's all about me, one attains peace. So that concept of of mine and I have a right to acquire this thing, it's mine to enjoy, and my life's endeavor is all about me and getting what I want. As long as we have those two conceptions of mine and I in the center, it's practically impossible to truly be peaceful. Relinquishing those two concepts, relinquishing this sense that the world belongs to us and we are the center of the world, is Krishna's prescription for actually attaining peace. Now, the last verse, one who relinquishes, O Partha, Arjuna, upon attaining this state of spiritual consciousness, one remains free from bewilderment, being firmly established in such consciousness, even if only at the moment of death, one extinguishes the forest fire of material existence and attains the spiritual realm. So this last line, one extinguishes the fire of material existence and attains the spiritual realm, translates the last line of the Sanskrit, Brahma Nirvanam Richchati. Richchati means rises or attains. Brahma Nirvanam. So nirvana is a Sanskrit word usually associated with Buddhism, meaning that state which is beyond all miseries. Vanam literally means to blow out, like blowing out a candle. But in this case, it's not just a candle, it's a whole forest fire. Vana means forest. So the material world is often considered to be like a forest fire, because in a forest fire, every tree is consumed in due course of time. And that's our situation. We are also consumed by the force of time. And to extinguish the forest fire of material existence is one of the objectives, or you could even say it is an objective of yoga in general. In devotional yoga, it's a side effect. It's something that occurs as a result of the practice, not even necessarily an objective. From the standpoint of yoga in general, you could say, yes, my objective is to be free from this obligation to continue in the perpetual cycle of birth and death. And once one is free, then it is the equivalent of extinguishing that forest fire and attains the spiritual realm. So Brahma Nirvanam is that spiritual realm that exists beyond the forest fire of material existence. And it doesn't mean you have to leave your body to get there, even though in the previous verse, or two verses back, Krishna implied that if one at the time of death has this state of mind, then one will be freed from this cycle. The cultivation of that consciousness throughout the course of one's life, at least the attempt to get there, is essential in order to actually have that state of consciousness at the moment we leave this body. So Brahma Nirvana, that place that is beyond the reach, beyond the realm of the forest fire of material existence. Now this is our concluding verse, and this set of verses has been kind of a summary of what Krishna has taught Arjuna, and by extension taught us up until this point. So at this point, I will ask you, do any of you, whether you're a Caps fan or a Rangers fan, I'm from New York, you can take me out of New York City, but you cannot take New York City out of me. So it's easy for me to be indifferent to the Stanley Cup finals this year, except that I actually kind of like to see Las Vegas win, because then a lot of bookies in Las Vegas are going to lose so much money because an expansion team has never won the Stanley Cup, but I just don't care. I'm indifferent. All right. Any questions on these conclusive verses from chapter 2? All right. In that case, hockey fans? Oh, we have a Red Wings fan. All right, Thea. Well, Detroit's a cool city. It's too cold for me, but a lot of cool things are happening there. And the Red Wings may be one of them. All right, so now that we've covered all of our bases, as far as hockey is concerned, let's move on to our chapter 2 recap. All right, so what I'm going to do is just kind of roll through the chapter one more time, just to cover some of the highlights. And if you have any questions that have just been sitting around from the entire chapter that you haven't actually had a chance to ask yet, then by all means, please go ahead and do so. So we will begin with the yoga of discernment, Sankhya. So Arjuna begins the chapter totally confused. He doesn't know what to do. He's got his reasons for not fighting, but it's inconclusive. He's got a conception of dharma based on his culture, the Vedic culture, and he's trying to think it through, and he just can't figure it out. He'd really like a way to get around this problem and find a way for everyone to live happily ever after, and he doesn't know how to do it, so he asks Krishna what to do. Krishna, smiling slightly, gives Arjuna his first instruction, which is, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. The very radical proposition that we are not created beings that arrive on the scene at any point in time. Now here's a far out thing. The complete absolute truth is complete. You can't take anything away, you can't add anything. And yet the complete absolute truth is unlimited and therefore unlimitedly expanding. Therefore, there must always be new spirit souls who have never been created and will never go out of existence. This is why the absolute truth is called achintya, inconceivable. If you could wrap your head around him, then wouldn't be the supreme being. Krishna also encourages a kind of detachment from family affection, which is only possible with an actual understanding, a visceral understanding, that we are not these material bodies. And the relationships that we have in this world are not eternal relationships in terms of the body. I gave the example of my eulogy of my mother when I offered that maybe next time I'll get to be her mother and return the favor that she was kind enough to bestow on me. We'll see. This can be a very challenging and very radical idea. When we spoke with Dhanadhar Swami, he spoke about the role of attachment in spiritual life. That is to say, the flip side of the coin, detachment from material life and material conceptions, attachment to those things that create favorable impressions on the mind for one's spiritual life. We also talked a little bit about the psychology of illusion, how Krishna describes the bewilderment of a person and what happens when we fall under the influence of illusion, and the role of equanimity in happiness and distress. The non-permanent appearance of happiness and distress and its disappearance in due course of time being like the coming and going of winter and summer seasons, which arise from sense perception, and one learns to tolerate them without being disturbed. So this also radical idea of tolerating happiness. We have an easy time considering or conceiving of how we might tolerate distress, but we never think about tolerating happiness, because tolerating is what you do when you have no choice. Well, just as distress comes uninvited and without warning, so happiness also just comes of its own accord. So in that sense, they are very much two sides of the same coin. Continuing our discussion of the yoga of discernment, we spoke about inaction in action, verses that require some additional insight, some explanation from a teacher. In this connection, we also spoke about verses where the meaning is self-evident. There's no need to interpret it. There's no need to overlay anything or allegorize it. It just means exactly what it says. But in a verse where you see one who knows inaction in action and can understand action in inaction is someone who actually understands what action is. All right, well, that requires a little explanation. And what Krishna is working his way towards in this section is how one can act without generating a reaction. Or the idea that spiritual action, karma yoga, is action in the world with a spiritual intention, and therefore an action that does not generate a material reaction. Sounds like it defies the laws of physics, and it does, because spiritual life is beyond the physical realm and therefore is not constrained by the same laws by which the physical world is constrained. This understanding leads to the experience of our true spiritual nature. We begin to actually have access to spiritual experience, and that experience of ourselves as eternal spiritual beings, and that compassionate detachment from the material world actually empowers us to act in the material world from a position of invincibility, from a position of confidence. I believe I asked at some point, how would this change your life? If you actually experienced yourself as an eternal spiritual being, as opposed to experiencing yourself as being this temporary mind and body, how would that change your life? How would that empower you to move through the world in a different way? And if you have any further thoughts on that, please share them. We also spoke about ethics and warfare. Remember, the Bhagavad-gita is being spoken on a battlefield, and Krishna is doing his level best to convince Arjuna to fight when Arjuna is thinking he doesn't want to fight, that there's got to be a way for him to not fight. And this sort of flies in the face of our usual idea of what we want from God when God shows up. We want rainbows and unicorns. We want everyone to love one another right now. And here Krishna is telling Arjuna, nope, sorry, bud, you actually have to try to kill your grandfather and your teacher and your cousins and everybody else on the other side. And for many people, this is a real showstopper in the Bhagavad-gita, the idea that a supreme being would sanction war. We spoke about just war theory. And if any of you missed it, you can go back, check it out. What constitutes a just war? When is fighting actually righteous? And do slain warriors go to heaven? Krishna tells Arjuna that he's actually in a win-win situation, not a lose-lose situation. If he fights and wins, he wins. He gets the earthly kingdom that is actually his birthright. And if he fights and loses, he dies on the battlefield and attains a heavenly reward. Now, does that sound a little too much like current events, the way some people think about religiously motivated self-sacrifice? What do you think about that? As we get further into the idea of karma yoga, the yoga of action, Krishna speaks about the relationship of knowledge to action, how action informed by knowledge, specifically transcendental knowledge, is liberating, whereas action performed absent such transcendental knowledge is entangling, is binding, is action that obliges one to continue in the cycle of birth and death, taking future births according to the reactions to the actions we generate. We also spoke in this section about how one who has acquired transcendental knowledge sees a goal beyond material life and remains focused on that goal. It's now the overriding priority of one's life, and everything else in one's life is now subordinate to this one objective that the yogi stays focused on. And dovetailing all the different aspects of one's life into the service of this objective for the benefit of oneself and ultimately also for the benefit of others is what the karma yogi is doing. The karma yogi is not doing free labor for a yoga studio, or for that matter, doing a yoga class for a good cause. This is the misuse of the term karma yoga, or the misunderstanding of the term karma yoga. Karma yoga actually aims at something higher, and you can do those things if you are so inclined, but there's an even higher intention beyond material welfare work. Simply engaging in something that benefits someone's mind and body for a period of time. There's got to be a component of transcendental knowledge aimed at understanding the true eternal self beyond the mind and body in whatever action one is engaged in. In this section, we also spoke about the Vedas. Veda itself, the word means knowledge. And the Vedas act as an operator's manual, a guide, a user guide, so that you know how to work the material world and how to get what you want from the material world. And Krishna kind of disses the Vedas insofar as they are a guide for operating the material world in order to get temporary benefits that you then have to repeat the process over and over and over again. He's not putting down the Vedic culture from which yoga arises. What he's telling Arjuna is that he's gotten caught up in the Vedic formulas for material life and has missed the ultimate objective of Vedic knowledge, which is transcendence beyond these temporary material gains that one can get by following the formulas of religiosity that bring about prosperity and material enjoyment. We spoke about action without attachment, or action that is motivated by a kind of compassionate detachment. My phrase for speaking about detachment, because it doesn't mean indifference. Specifically, the one thing that a yogi cannot tolerate is the suffering of others. We do not become indifferent to the world. We do not think, doesn't matter if we throw poisons in the river because it's just the material world, it's not important, it's all illusion anyway. We don't think like that. Things that happen in the world still matter, and we make an investment in making the world a better place for everyone to cultivate spiritual knowledge and make progress in their spiritual lives. What we don't get attached to is the result, because we know the results are beyond our control. We're not responsible for the result. We're responsible for our engagement in the process and the intention behind our actions. But the result, we cultivate detachment from. Krishna describes yoga as virtuosity in action, or the art of all work. And therefore, he encourages Arjuna that in all circumstances, he should be a yogi. He should be performing yoga. In other words, we can make everything we do yoga. There's a blog site called It's All Yoga, Baby. It's all yoga if we make it all yoga, and we can. And that's what karma yoga is, the art of making everything that we do yoga. So think about this. What part of your life is a part of your life that you don't think of as being yoga? How do you make it yoga? What part of your life do you think of as being yoga that might not look like yoga on the surface? What's yogic about it? How is it yoga? What makes what you're doing yogic? So play with that both ways. If you know something in your life is not actually part of your life of yoga, how can you make it part of your life of yoga? If you think something or everything that you do is yoga, then think of one of those things and ask yourself, what makes this yoga? What's yogic about it? See what you come up with. You can ask yourself, as long as you're at it, what does it mean to be liberated? In the Bhagavad-gita, liberation means several things. It means freedom from the obligation to take birth in the material world in a material body, subject to all of its various problems. It means freedom from the influence of the three qualities of material nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance, that make us who we appear to be. Moving forward, we're going to revisit these three qualities of material nature and once again go into them in some detail. They are the elements, the basic constituent parts of every person, place, and thing, including ourselves. Freedom from the influence of these modes or qualities of material nature. That's another way to think about what it means to be liberated. Free from the compulsion to respond to whatever desire our senses present to us. Being in control of one's senses. That's another thing that we can think of as being liberated. So control of the mind and senses is the first objective of yoga practice. And we can control the mind by controlling the senses, by the regulation of the senses, not giving in to every little thing that the senses want. Then we gain control over the mind. So we can work our way back from outside, what the senses see, hear, feel, smell, taste, what they want. Controlling the senses is a key to bringing the mind itself under control, as the mind is the reservoir of the senses. So if the rivers flowing into the mind are rushing madly, then the mind is more likely to be agitated. The reservoir will more likely be moving. If the rivers themselves are flowing easily, calmly, smoothly, then the reservoir of the mind also stabilizes. Yoga is defined by the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind in the Yoga Sutras. So here, the Bhagavad-gita in the second chapter covers all of these different definitions of yoga, control of the mind and senses, and then beyond that, the integration of knowledge and action. Normally we think of yoga and meditation in a classical sense as being the withdrawal from the world and a kind of inaction, simply turning inward, pratyahara, and then the process of meditation, which involves sitting still. And here, Krishna is saying, no, not just that. You take your meditation into your action, and your action is informed by knowledge. Your action is informed by your introspective practice. You find equanimity in action by informing your action with knowledge and realization, and thus you engage in the art of liberating action, action that does not produce a reaction, and more detail about how that occurs is going to show up in the next chapter. So all of these definitions of yoga, or these aspects of yoga, are covered in this second chapter. As we head towards the end of the chapter, Arjuna asks about the symptoms of one who is in transcendental knowledge. How do you recognize someone who has achieved this? One who has turned their senses inward, who's no longer looking outward for everything, but rather is looking inward for the self, who has the mind and senses under control, and who has acquired a higher taste for the inner life of spiritual enlightenment, and is therefore spontaneously inclined to prioritize that inner journey over anything going on in the outside world, even though still engaged with the outside world, not absorbed in the goings on of the outside world or pursuing the priorities of material life. The sequence of illusion. Meditation in material consciousness. By contemplating the objects of the senses, one develops attachment for them. By the development of that attachment, one gains or is placed under the influence of an insatiable desire to have the object of one's attachment. Once one falls under the influence of this insatiable desire, one gets angry, frustrated, because either you don't have it, or you get it and it's not all that it's cracked up to be, or you get it and it's great, but then you're going to lose it. Anger arises. And from anger comes bewilderment of memory. You forget who you are. From bewilderment of memory, intelligence is lost, the ability to make a distinction between spirit and matter, who you are and who you are not, disappears, and at that point, the self disappears from view. One falls into the condition of ignorance. Reversing this sequence is the key to peace, happiness, and wisdom, sustainable peace, happiness, and wisdom. So here's how we reverse the sequence. And this now plays back on this idea of developing spiritual attachments, the role of positive attachments in our spiritual lives. When one's thoughts dwell on objects that awaken the spiritual senses, attachment to those objects develops. From attachment to spiritual objects, objects of spiritual awakening, the desire to satisfy the spiritual senses is born, the higher taste. And from the desire to satisfy the spiritual senses, tranquility arises. From tranquility, one gains clarity, and with clarity comes the awakening of one's memory. When one's memory is revived, the power of discernment is recovered, and with it, when the power of discernment returns, perception of the self is restored. So that's how you put that sequence of illusion into reverse in order to have a sequence of once again being able to perceive reality, one's true nature. And then this evening we spoke about the journey from material life to spiritual life being like the journey from night to day, or as being as different as night and day. The indifference that one develops towards material pursuits accompanied by enthusiasm for spiritual pursuits, which really differentiates the introspective yogi from those who are absorbed in the pursuit of the fulfillment of material desires. So cultivating this indifference to material desires results in ultimate freedom, freedom from those desires, the influence of those desires, freedom from material misconceptions, freedom from illusion. This second chapter lines up very nicely with the 5 obstacles to yoga we find in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We overcome ignorance by understanding that we are not these temporary material bodies, we're eternal spirit souls. We overcome the influence of egoism by taking ourselves out of the center, letting go of this conception of mine and I. We overcome attachment by cultivating compassionate detachment and equanimity. We remain equipoised in happiness and distress. And thus we overcome our fear of death, understanding ourselves to actually be deathless. One of the names given to this second chapter of the Bhagavad-gita is the contents of the Gita summarized. So what we've gotten is an overview of the yoga system and the goal of the yoga system. And now, in keeping with the elliptical pattern that I described at the outset of our webinar series, we will now get into greater and greater levels of detail as to how this is accomplished. All right. Any questions about this recap? While you are thinking about your questions, I will let you know that this evening we covered the conclusion of the Yoga of Analysis, chapter 2 of the Bhagavad-gita, verses 69 through 72, plus our recap of the entire chapter. If you have any questions after the fact, please send them to me. My email address is hari@harikirtan.com. I am always very, very happy to hear from you. Next week, we begin chapter 3 Karma Yoga is actually the name of the chapter. If you have not yet understood the Bhagavad-gita, don't worry. Arjuna hasn't understood it yet either. So you're in really good company. Arjuna doesn't get it. He's got some doubt-based questions coming up. He's actually confused. And he's going to ask Krishna to clarify the stuff that he's confused about. So if you're confused, don't worry. So is Arjuna. We'll talk about action versus renunciation and how to be a yoga poser. Everyone wants to be a yoga poser. Maybe you don't, but I'll explain to you how the Bhagavad-gita tells us you can be a poser. All right. We have come to the end of our allotted time for this evening. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you after the fact. I will be posting something on our Facebook page, so please join us there for more discussion of these wonderful topics of the Bhagavad-gita. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you here next Thursday night. Okay, thank you very much.